In the spring of 1851, 12-year-old Jeremiah Holbrook made a discovery that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Working in the cramped back room of Fletcher's funeral parlor in Sutters Creek, California, the boy had developed an unusual habit. He counted every body that passed through those wooden doors. By May of that year, his careful tally showed something impossible. 43 corpses had arrived for burial, yet the town records showed only 27 official deaths. 16 men had simply vanished from existence, their deaths unrecorded, their gold claims mysteriously transferred to new owners within days of their disappearance. For decades, the surviving residents of Sutters Creek kept this secret buried deeper than any grave until now. Before we continue with the story of Jeremiah Holbrook and the dark truth he uncovered in those gold-fevered hills, take a moment to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. We bring you the most chilling historical mysteries America has to offer. And tell us in the comments, what state are you listening from? We love connecting with fellow mystery lovers across the country. The transition from innocence to horror began on an ordinary Tuesday morning when young Jeremiah first noticed the discrepancy that would consume his thoughts for months to come. Sutters Creek wasn't much more than a collection of hastily built wooden structures clinging to the Sierra Nevada foothills. But the discovery of gold in nearby streams had transformed it from a sleepy trading post into a bustling hub of desperate ambition. By 1851, nearly 800 souls called the town home, a mixture of former farmers from Missouri, failed merchants from Boston, and immigrants from as far as Chile and China, all united by the same golden dream that had lured them west. Jeremiah Holbrook had arrived in Sutters Creek 6 months earlier with his widowed mother, Sarah, after their small farm in Ohio had failed. Sarah had taken work as a seamstress, while 12-year-old Jeremiah found employment with Silas Fletcher, the town's only undertaker. The boy's small hands and keen attention to detail made him perfect for preparing bodies and maintaining the funeral parlor's meticulous records, a task that required noting every detail about the deceased, from their apparent cause of death to their personal effects. The work was grim for a child, but the California gold rush had hardened everyone quickly. Death was a constant companion in Sutters Creek. Men died from cave-ins in hastily dug mines, from dysentery that swept through the camps, from fights over claims that turned deadly in the California heat. Others simply worked themselves to death, their bodies giving out from the back-breaking labor of sifting through tons of dirt and rock for a few precious flakes of gold. What made Jeremiah particularly suited for his position was his methodical nature, a trait that would prove both blessing and curse. Each evening, he would carefully record the day's arrivals in his personal ledger, noting not just the official information Mr. Fletcher required, but also his own observations about the condition of the bodies, the circumstances of their arrival, and any unusual details he noticed. It was this habit that first alerted him to the terrible arithmetic that didn't add up. The boy had also developed relationships with many of the town's residents during his 6 months in Sutters Creek. There was Magnus Carlson, the gentle Swedish miner who always tipped his hat to Jeremiah when they passed on Main Street, and who had struck a modest vein just 2 weeks prior. There was Chen Wei, the Chinese prospector who spoke broken English but always smiled warmly at the boy, and whose recent discovery of several sizable nuggets had been the talk of the settlement. And there was Roberto Vasquez, the Mexican vaquero turned miner, whose laugh could be heard from 3 blocks away, and who had just filed a particularly promising claim near Coyote Gulch. All 3 men would soon become entries in Jeremiah's private ledger, though none would appear in the town's official death records. The first body that made Jeremiah truly suspicious arrived on a foggy Thursday morning in late April, carried in by 2 men the boy didn't recognize. Jeremiah was in the back room of Fletcher's funeral parlor, organizing the coffin nails by size, when he heard the heavy footsteps on the front porch. Through the thin wooden walls he could hear Mr. Fletcher's voice greeting the visitors, followed by the unmistakable sound of a body being dragged across the threshold. This wasn't unusual. Most of the deceased in Sutter's Creek were brought in by fellow miners or business associates, since few had family in California. What struck Jeremiah as odd was the hushed, urgent tone of the conversation. Normally, those who brought in the dead were somber but matter-of-fact about the circumstances. Death was too common in the gold fields for elaborate grief. But these men spoke in whispers, and there was something furtive about their manner that made the boy press his ear to the connecting door. "Found him in his claim this morning," one of the men was saying. "Looks like his heart gave out. You know how these older fellows push themselves too hard." Jeremiah frowned. The voice mentioned older fellow, but when he peered through a gap in the door, he saw the unmistakable red flannel shirt and thick blonde beard of Magnus Carlsson. The Swedish miner was only 34 years old, hardly an old man even by gold rush standards. "Any family we should notify?" Fletcher asked, his voice carrying the practiced sympathy of his profession. "None that we know of," the second man replied quickly. "Keep it simple. We'll pay for a basic burial." After the men left, Jeremiah helped Fletcher examine the body. Magnus lay on the preparation table, his skin pale but without the waxy appearance that usually accompanied heart failure. What troubled the boy more was what he didn't see. There were no personal effects. Magnus always carried a small leather pouch containing his gold dust and a silver pocket watch that had belonged to his father. Every miner in Sutter's Creek guarded such possessions with their life. "Mr. Fletcher," Jeremiah ventured carefully, "shouldn't Magnus have had his gold pouch with him?" The undertaker paused in his examination, giving the boy a sharp look. "Men die in all sorts of circumstances, Jeremiah. Sometimes their belongings get scattered or other miners find the body and, well, the gold fields can make even good men do desperate things." But Jeremiah wasn't satisfied. That evening he made his way to Magnus's mining claim near Willow Creek. The Swedish miner had been working a small but productive section of streambed using a technique called cradling that required patient, methodical work. What Jeremiah found there made his blood run cold. Magnus's tools were arranged neatly beside his claim, as if he had simply set them down for a lunch break. His tin cup still contained cold coffee, and beside it lay a piece of bread with only one bite taken from it. But there were signs of disturbance that didn't match the story of a man dying peacefully of heart failure. The dirt around the claim showed evidence of a struggle, scuff marks and overturned rocks that suggested something violent had occurred. Most disturbing of all was what Jeremiah found partially buried under a pile of loose gravel. Magnus's leather gold pouch, but completely empty. Beside it was the silver pocket watch, its chain snapped as if torn forcibly from his vest. As Jeremiah examined the broken watch, he heard footsteps approaching through the brush. Heart pounding, he quickly pocketed both items and scrambled up the bank, hiding behind a large boulder just as two figures emerged into the clearing. Even in the fading light, he recognized them as the same men who had brought Magnus's body to the funeral parlor. "You sure nobody saw us come back here?" one of them asked nervously. "Relax, Patterson. Who's going to be poking around a dead man's claim after dark?" The name Patterson sent a chill through Jeremiah's spine. He knew that name, Deputy Thomas Patterson, one of Sheriff Coleman's most trusted men. What was a lawman doing at a dead man's claim in the dark? "Still don't like it," Patterson muttered. "Too many people knew about Carlsson's strike. Someone's going to ask questions. Let them ask. As far as anyone knows, the Swede worked himself to death, and his claim reverts to public land. Coleman will handle the paperwork, and by next week, we'll have legitimate ownership." Jeremiah pressed himself against the boulder, barely daring to breathe as the two men examined the claim site. They spent several minutes checking the area, and the boy realized with growing horror that they were making sure they hadn't left any evidence of their crime. As the men finally departed, their lantern light fading into the darkness, Jeremiah remained hidden behind the boulder for nearly an hour, his mind racing. Magnus Carlsson hadn't died of heart failure. He had been murdered for his gold claim, and somehow Deputy Patterson and his companion were involved. But this was only the beginning of the terrible truth that would unfold in the weeks to come. The revelation about Magnus Carlsen's true fate haunted Jeremiah through the following days. But it was Chen Wei's death that transformed suspicion into certainty. 3 days after Magnus's funeral, the Chinese prospector's body arrived at Fletcher's funeral parlor under circumstances that followed an eerily similar pattern. Once again, 2 men Jeremiah didn't recognize brought the corpse, claiming they had found Chen dead in his tent from what appeared to be dysentery. Once again, there were no personal effects, despite the fact that Chen was known to have recently discovered several sizable gold nuggets that he kept in a small jade container his grandmother had given him in Canton. But Jeremiah was watching more carefully now. When he helped Fletcher prepare Chen's body, he noticed details that told a different story than the one the men had provided. Chen's fingernails were packed with dirt and debris, and there were scrapes on his knuckles that suggested he had fought desperately for his life. More tellingly, there was a small puncture wound behind his left ear, barely visible beneath his black hair. A wound that looked suspiciously like it had been made by a thin blade. That night, Jeremiah made his second clandestine journey to a dead man's claim. Chen's modest camp was located in a narrow canyon about 2 miles east of town, where the Chinese miner had been working a section of alluvial deposits with remarkable success. What Jeremiah found there shattered any remaining doubts about what was happening in Sutter's Creek. Chen's camp showed clear signs of violence. His small tent had been slashed open from the outside, and his belongings were scattered across the campsite as if someone had searched frantically for something specific. But hidden beneath a loose floorboard in Chen's sleeping area, Jeremiah discovered something the killers had missed: a detailed journal written in Chinese characters, accompanied by crude maps and sketches. Though Jeremiah couldn't read the Chinese writing, the maps were clear enough. Chen had been documenting not just his own mining activities, but also those of other successful prospectors in the area. The journal contained detailed sketches of Magnus Carlsen's claim, along with notations about the Swedish miners' recent discoveries. There were also maps of at least 6 other claims belonging to miners who had struck gold in recent weeks. As Jeremiah studied the journal by moonlight, a terrible pattern began to emerge. Chen Wei hadn't just been a victim. He had been systematically gathering intelligence about successful miners in the area. But why? And more importantly, who had he been working for? The answer came sooner than Jeremiah expected. As he prepared to leave Chen's abandoned camp, he heard the approach of multiple horses. Panicking, he stuffed the journal inside his shirt and scrambled up the canyon wall, finding shelter behind a cluster of manzanita bushes just as 5 mounted figures rode into the clearing below. Even in the darkness, Jeremiah recognized Sheriff Benjamin Coleman's distinctive silhouette. The lawman was a large, imposing figure who wore his authority like a badge of honor, and his presence at the murder scene sent waves of terror through the boy's small frame. But it was Coleman's words to his companions that truly chilled Jeremiah to the bone. "Wei did good work for us," the sheriff said, dismounting near the destroyed tent. "His maps are going to save us months of scouting. Too bad he got greedy and started asking for a bigger cut." "What about his replacement?" asked a voice Jeremiah recognized as Deputy Patterson. "We still need someone who can move around the Chinese camps without attracting attention." "Already working on it," Coleman replied. "There's a new fellow named Lee came in on yesterday's wagon train, desperate for work, doesn't speak much English. Perfect for our needs." As the men conducted their search of the campsite, Jeremiah remained frozen in his hiding place, scarcely believing what he was witnessing. The sheriff of Sutter's Creek wasn't investigating these murders, he was orchestrating them. Chen Wei had been working as an informant, identifying successful miners who could be robbed and killed without drawing too much attention. And when Chen had demanded more money for his services, he had become a liability that needed to be eliminated. The implications were staggering. If Sheriff Coleman was behind these murders, then the law itself had been corrupted by gold fever. There was no one Jeremiah could trust, no authority he could turn to for help. Worse yet, the boy now possessed evidence that could get him killed. Chen's journal was detailed proof of the conspiracy, assuming anyone could translate the Chinese text. As dawn approached and the sheriff's men finally departed, Jeremiah made his way back to town in a state of numb terror. He had stumbled onto something far more dangerous than a simple murder. He had discovered a systematic operation designed to identify, rob, and eliminate successful prospectors while covering up the crimes through official channels. But the worst realization was yet to come. As Jeremiah entered the funeral parlor and quietly made his way to his small sleeping area in the back room, he found a note waiting on his pillow. Written in crude block letters, the message was brief but terrifying. Some secrets are worth dying for. Keep your mouth shut and your eyes closed, boy. Someone knew that Jeremiah had been investigating the deaths. Someone was watching him. And if he wasn't careful, the next body to arrive at Fletcher's funeral parlor might be his own. The anonymous threat should have silenced Jeremiah, but instead it ignited a desperate need to understand the full scope of the conspiracy that had consumed his town. Over the following weeks, the boy became obsessed with his secret investigation, developing elaborate methods to avoid detection while gathering evidence. He began making careful note of every conversation he overheard in the funeral parlor, every suspicious glance exchanged between the men who brought in bodies, and every discrepancy between the official cause of death and what his own observations suggested. His private ledger grew into a detailed chronicle of murder and corruption. Roberto Vasquez, the jovial Mexican vaquero, had allegedly died from a rattlesnake bite. But Jeremiah's examination revealed no fang marks, only a suspicious wound that looked more like a knife thrust between the ribs. James Hendricks, an elderly prospector from Tennessee, had supposedly fallen into a mine shaft, but his injuries were inconsistent with a fall, and his famous collection of gold coins had vanished without explanation. Each new body that arrived at Fletcher's funeral parlor added another piece to the horrifying puzzle. The victims all shared certain characteristics. They were successful miners who had recently struck gold. They were relative newcomers to Sutter's Creek, with no local family to ask difficult questions, and they all had valuable claims that mysteriously became available for new ownership within days of their deaths. But it was the discovery of Sheriff Coleman's property acquisitions that revealed the true scale of the operation. Using his mother's connections with the town's seamstresses and washerwomen, women who cleaned and mended clothes for the town's elite, Jeremiah learned that Coleman had quietly purchased or gained control of nearly 24 mining claims over the past 8 months. Claims that had previously belonged to men who were now buried in Sutter's Creek's Boot Hill Cemetery. The sheriff's growing wealth hadn't gone entirely unnoticed. Coleman had built a new house on the hill overlooking town, far grander than anything a lawman's salary could afford. He had also invested in the general store, the saloon, and was rumored to be backing the construction of a new hotel. But in a town where striking it rich was every man's dream, Coleman's prosperity was attributed to lucky investments and shrewd business sense rather than systematic murder. Jeremiah's investigation took a dangerous turn when he decided to follow Deputy Patterson during one of his evening patrols. The boy had noticed that Patterson often left town after sunset, claiming to be checking on remote mining camps for security purposes. But Jeremiah suspected these nocturnal journeys served a darker purpose. On a moonless night in early June, Jeremiah shadowed Patterson as the deputy rode toward the network of claims that spread along Deer Creek, about 5 miles northeast of town. Staying far enough behind to avoid detection, the boy watched as Patterson met with 2 other men at a crossroads. Men Jeremiah recognized as the same individuals who had been bringing suspicious corpses to the funeral parlor. Hidden behind a fallen log, Jeremiah listened as the 3 men discussed their next target, a German immigrant named Klaus Weber, who had recently discovered a rich vein of quartz that was yielding substantial amounts of gold. Weber was known to be a loner who kept to himself and had few friends in town. Perfect prey for the murderous conspiracy. Weber's camp is isolated, Patterson was saying. No neighbors for miles, and he's been talking about heading back to Germany once he's saved enough money. If he disappears, people will just assume he decided to leave early. What about his claim? Asked one of the other men, whose voice Jeremiah recognized as belonging to Frank Garrett, a failed prospector who now worked as a general laborer around town. "Coleman's already filed the preliminary paperwork," Patterson replied. "Once Weber's gone, the claim will be declared abandoned and auctioned. The sheriff will be the only bidder." The casual way they discussed murder made Jeremiah's stomach turn. But worse was the realization that Klaus Weber would be dead within days unless someone warned him. Yet how could a 12-year-old boy convince anyone that the sheriff and his deputies were systematic killers? Who would believe such an incredible accusation? As Jeremiah pondered this dilemma, he made a crucial mistake. Shifting his position to get a better view of the meeting, he accidentally knocked loose several small rocks that clattered down the hillside. The sound wasn't loud, but in the stillness of the night it was enough to alert the three conspirators. "What was that?" Garrett hissed, his hand moving instinctively to the gun at his hip. "Probably just an animal," Patterson replied, but his voice carried uncertainty. "Maybe, but let's take a look around just to be sure." The three men spread out, searching the area with practiced efficiency that spoke of military or law enforcement training. Jeremiah pressed himself against the ground behind the fallen log, hardly daring to breathe as footsteps approached his hiding place. Through a gap in the wood, he could see Garrett's boots passing just inches from his face. "Nothing over here," Garrett finally called out, but his voice suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. "Let's finish this somewhere else," Patterson decided. "Too many ears in these hills." As the three men remounted and rode away, Jeremiah remained motionless for nearly an hour, his heart pounding so hard he was certain it could be heard for miles. When he finally crept out of his hiding place, his clothes were soaked with sweat, despite the cool night air. The boy's close call had provided crucial intelligence, but it had also escalated the danger significantly. If Patterson or his associates had spotted him, Jeremiah's investigation would be over, along with his life. But the knowledge that Klaus Weber was targeted for murder created a moral crisis the boy couldn't ignore. As Jeremiah made his way back to town through the darkness, he realized that his passive observation had reached its limits. If he wanted to prevent more deaths and expose the conspiracy, he would have to take direct action. But in a town where the law itself was corrupted, what could one 12-year-old boy possibly do? The answer would come to him in the most unexpected way, through a source he had never considered: the dead themselves. Jeremiah's breakthrough came from an unlikely discovery, hidden within the personal effects that killers had missed. A discovery that would provide him with the evidence he needed, while simultaneously placing him in mortal danger. The revelation began with the arrival of Ezra Whitfield's body on a sweltering Tuesday morning in mid-June. Whitfield had been a cautious, methodical miner from Vermont who had spent months working a modest claim near Bear Creek with little success until, 3 weeks earlier, he had struck a rich pocket of gold that had made him one of the wealthiest men in the area. True to the pattern Jeremiah had documented, Whitfield's death was attributed to natural causes. In this case, a heart attack brought on by the California heat. But the boy's examination revealed a different story. Whitfield's body showed signs of strangulation, with faint bruising around the throat that had been skillfully concealed by the positioning of his shirt collar. What made this case different was Whitfield's paranoid nature. The Vermont miner had been deeply suspicious of everyone around him, convinced that his success had made him a target for thieves and claim jumpers. This paranoia had led him to take precautions that his killers hadn't anticipated. While preparing Whitfield's body, Jeremiah discovered something sewn into the lining of the dead man's vest. A small leather packet containing a detailed letter addressed to Whitfield's brother in Vermont. The letter, dated just 2 days before the miner's death, contained explosive revelations about the situation in Sutter's Creek. Whitfield had been conducting his own investigation into the suspicious deaths around town. Unlike Jeremiah, the adult miner had possessed the resources and connections to gather concrete evidence of the conspiracy. His letter detailed financial records showing Sheriff Coleman's impossible wealth, documented the pattern of claim transfers following suspicious deaths, and even included a list of names. both victims and conspirators. But most importantly, Whitfield had uncovered the true scope of the operation. The murders weren't random acts of greed committed by a few corrupt lawmen. They were part of a systematic plan to control the most productive mining claims in the entire region, with Sheriff Coleman serving as the local face of a larger criminal organization that extended throughout the California gold fields. According to Whitfield's research, similar operations were running in at least 6 other mining towns, all coordinated by a mysterious figure known only as the Syndicate Boss. This individual was systematically acquiring the most valuable mining properties in California through murder, fraud, and corruption, building a gold mining empire on the foundation of countless graves. The letter also revealed why Chen Wei had been working as an informant. The Chinese miner hadn't been motivated by greed alone. His younger brother was being held prisoner in San Francisco as leverage to ensure Chen's cooperation. When Chen had demanded his brother's release and threatened to expose the operation, he had signed his own death warrant. But perhaps most terrifying of all was Whitfield's final observation. He suspected that someone in town was systematically eliminating anyone who got too close to the truth. Several residents who had asked too many questions about the suspicious deaths had themselves died under mysterious circumstances, their deaths carefully disguised as accidents or natural causes. As Jeremiah read Whitfield's letter by candlelight in the funeral parlor's back room, he realized that his own investigation had not gone unnoticed. The anonymous threat he had received weeks earlier wasn't just a warning. It was a death sentence that had simply been delayed for reasons he didn't yet understand. The boy's hands trembled as he reached the letter's final paragraph. "If something happens to me before I can mail this letter, it will prove that my suspicions are correct. Look for a boy who works at the funeral parlor. He has been watching everything, and he may be the only one who can expose the truth. But warn him, they know about his investigation, and his days are numbered." Jeremiah nearly dropped the letter as the implications sank in. Whitfield had noticed his investigation and had tried to protect him even while facing his own imminent death. But if Whitfield knew about Jeremiah's activities, then others certainly did as well. The sound of footsteps on the funeral parlor's front porch interrupted his thoughts. Quickly hiding Whitfield's letter inside his shirt, Jeremiah blew out the candle and crept to the window. 3 figures were approaching the building in the pre-dawn darkness, moving with the careful stealth of men conducting clandestine business. Sheriff Coleman's voice carried clearly through the thin wooden walls as the men entered the main room of the funeral parlor. "Fletcher's not here this early. Good. We can handle this quietly. You sure the boy doesn't suspect anything?" This was Patterson's voice, tight with anxiety. "He's been poking around where he shouldn't," replied a third voice that Jeremiah recognized as belonging to Frank Garrett. "But he's just a kid. Easy enough to handle. Maybe too easy." Coleman's voice carried a note of concern. "Dead children raise questions even in a place like this. We need to be smarter about it." Jeremiah's blood turned to ice as he realized they were discussing his murder. He pressed himself against the wall, hardly daring to breathe as the 3 men continued their conversation in the next room. "What about making it look like an accident?" Patterson suggested. "Mining accident, maybe. Lots of kids get curious about claims and wander into dangerous areas." "Too obvious," Coleman replied. "Half the town knows the boy never goes near the mines. We need something more believable." "Sickness," Garrett offered. "Cholera's been going around. One more kid dying from fever won't raise any eyebrows." "Now you're thinking," Coleman's voice carried approval. "But we need to move fast. The boy's been asking too many questions, and sooner or later he's going to figure out something that could hurt us." As the men began discussing the specific details of how they planned to murder him, Jeremiah realized that his time had run out. Whether he was ready or not, he had to act immediately or join the growing list of victims buried in Boot Hill Cemetery. But as terror threatened to overwhelm him, the boy's methodical nature asserted itself. He had evidence: Chen Wei's journal, Whitfield's letter, and his own detailed ledger documenting the conspiracy. If he could get this information to someone in authority outside of Sutter's Creek, the entire operation could be exposed. The problem was getting out of town alive. Sheriff Coleman controlled all the main roads, and his network of informants extended throughout the region. Jeremiah would need help from someone he could trust absolutely, someone who had as much reason to hate the conspiracy as he did. As dawn began to break over the Sierra Nevada peaks, illuminating the false respectability of Sutter's Creek's main street, Jeremiah Holbrook made a decision that would either save his life or seal his fate. He was going to find Klaus Weber and warn the German miner about the plot against him. Together, they might have enough firepower, both literal and figurative, to fight back against the corruption that had consumed their town. But first, he had to survive the next 24 hours, and with Sheriff Coleman's men actively hunting for him, that would require every ounce of cunning and courage the 12-year-old boy possessed. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Sutter's Creek intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries, hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. Jeremiah's desperate gamble to warn Klaus Weber would lead to a confrontation that exposed the full horror of Sutter's Creek's conspiracy, and nearly cost him his life in the process. The boy slipped out of the funeral parlor through a back window just as Sheriff Coleman and his men concluded their planning session. With his evidence hidden inside his shirt and his mother's sewing scissors tucked into his boot as a makeshift weapon, Jeremiah set off through the pre-dawn darkness toward Weber's isolated claim in the foothills above town. The German miners' camp was a study in Teutonic efficiency. Neat rows of equipment, carefully organized supplies, and a small but sturdy cabin that Weber had built with his own hands. Jeremiah found the miner preparing for his morning shift, methodically checking his tools and equipment as the first light of dawn painted the eastern peaks. Klaus Weber was a compact, serious man in his 40s who spoke English with a thick accent but understood it perfectly. When Jeremiah burst into his camp with wild stories of murder conspiracies and corrupt lawmen, Weber's first instinct was skepticism. But the boy's detailed knowledge of the victims and his evidence, Chenway's journal and Whitfield's letter, quickly convinced the German that the danger was real. "Mein Gott," Weber whispered as he studied Whitfield's letter with the help of a German-English dictionary. "They are planning to kill me tonight?" "Maybe sooner," Jeremiah replied, his voice tight with fear. "Sheriff Coleman knows I've been investigating. Once they realize I'm gone, they'll come looking for me here." Weber's response surprised the boy. Rather than fleeing immediately, the German miner began gathering specific items from around his camp. Several sticks of dynamite left over from his mining operations, his hunting rifle, and a small strongbox that contained his accumulated gold. But most importantly, he retrieved a leather portfolio from a hidden compartment in his cabin floor. "What's that?" Jeremiah asked, watching Weber examine the portfolio's contents. "Insurance," Weber replied grimly. "I have been writing letters to my brother in Germany, documenting everything I see in this town, names, dates, suspicious deaths. If something happens to me, he has instructions to send these letters to the territorial authorities in Sacramento." The two unlikely allies had barely finished their preparations when the sound of approaching horses echoed through the canyon. Weber grabbed his rifle and motioned for Jeremiah to take cover behind a large boulder, but it was too late for either of them to escape. Sheriff Coleman, Deputy Patterson, Frank Garrett, and two other men Jeremiah didn't recognize had surrounded the camp. "Klaus Weber!" Coleman's voice boomed across the clearing. "Come out with your hands visible. We need to ask you some questions about claim jumping in this area." Weber and Jeremiah exchanged a look of desperate understanding. They both knew this was no routine inquiry. It was an execution squad masquerading as law enforcement. "I am a lawful miner with proper claims," Weber called back, his rifle trained on the tree line where Coleman's voice had come from. "If you have questions, come back during daylight with proper warrants." Coleman's laughter was cold and humorless. "I'm afraid that's not how this works, Klaus. You see, we have evidence that you've been working claims that don't belong to you. That's a hanging offense in these parts. What followed was a standoff that lasted nearly an hour, with Coleman's men gradually moving into position around Weber's camp, while the German miner and Jeremiah remained pinned down behind their boulder. But Weber had advantages that Coleman hadn't anticipated. Extensive military experience from his service in the Prussian army, intimate knowledge of his own mining claims geography, and desperate motivation to survive. The final confrontation began when Garrett tried to sneak around to the back of Weber's cabin. The German miner spotted the movement and fired a warning shot that sent Garrett diving for cover, but also revealed Weber's position to the other attackers. "Take them alive if possible," Coleman shouted. "Dead men can't sign claim transfers, and we need this to look legal." But Weber had no intention of being taken alive. Using his knowledge of explosives, he created a diversion by detonating one of his dynamite sticks near the stream that ran through his claim. The explosion sent dirt and rocks showering down on Coleman's men, providing cover for Weber and Jeremiah to move to a more defensible position among the mining equipment. The battle that followed was brief but intense. Weber's military training and desperate determination proved more than a match for Coleman's overconfident thugs. When the smoke cleared, Frank Garrett lay dead from a rifle shot. One of the unknown attackers was wounded and fleeing back toward town, and the others had retreated to a safe distance to reassess their strategy. But victory came at a cost. Weber had been hit in the shoulder by Patterson's pistol, and blood was seeping through his shirt at an alarming rate. Worse yet, the sound of gunfire would have been heard for miles, and reinforcements would certainly be arriving soon. "Boy!" Weber gasped, pressing a bloodied hand to his wound. "You must take my papers and get to Sacramento. Find Marshal Harrison. He is honest man, not part of this corruption. I'm not leaving you here," Jeremiah protested, but Weber cut him off with surprising gentleness. "You must. These papers, your evidence. This is only way to stop them. I will hold them here as long as I can, but you must go now." As if to emphasize the urgency of the situation, the sound of more approaching horses echoed through the canyon. Coleman had summoned additional men, probably claiming that Weber and Jeremiah were dangerous criminals who had attacked law enforcement officers. Weber pressed his leather portfolio into Jeremiah's hands, along with his small, strong box of gold. "For expenses," he explained when the boy started to protest, "and proof that I trust you to do right thing." Jeremiah wanted to argue, but the approaching hoofbeats made debate impossible. With tears streaming down his face, the 12-year-old boy took Weber's evidence and began climbing up the canyon wall toward a deer trail that would take him around the back of the hills and eventually to the main road to Sacramento. Behind him, he could hear Weber calling out to the approaching riders, "I know what you are doing, Coleman. I have proof, and it is already on its way to authorities who cannot be bought." The gunfire that followed echoed through the Sierra Nevada foothills like thunder, and Jeremiah knew that Klaus Weber would not be joining the men who had died at Fletcher's funeral parlor. The German miner had chosen to make his final stand in defense of justice, buying Jeremiah the time he needed to escape with evidence that could finally expose the conspiracy. But the boy's ordeal was far from over. He still had to reach Sacramento alive, convince the territorial authorities to believe an incredible story told by a 12-year-old, and somehow survive long enough to see justice done. In a territory where gold fever had corrupted even the highest levels of government that would prove to be the most dangerous challenge of all. Jeremiah's journey to Sacramento took 3 harrowing days, during which he narrowly avoided capture by Coleman's men on 2 separate occasions and survived on wild berries and stream water while navigating treacherous mountain trails with only Weber's crude maps to guide him. The first near capture occurred at a trading post called Miller's Station, where Jeremiah had stopped to beg for food and water. He was hiding in the stable behind the main building when he heard familiar voices ordering supplies for an extended manhunt. Through gaps in the wooden walls, he watched Deputy Patterson questioning the station owner about any unusual travelers. specifically mentioning a dangerous young criminal who had murdered a respected German miner and stolen his gold. The lies came so easily to Patterson that Jeremiah almost doubted his own memories of the events at Weber's claim. But the deputy's description of the stolen gold matched exactly the contents of Weber's strongbox, confirming that the German miner was indeed dead, and that Coleman's men were spinning an elaborate cover story to explain the violence. Jeremiah waited until nightfall before continuing his journey, taking even more remote trails that added a full day to his travel time, but kept him away from the main roads where Coleman's influence might reach. The second near capture came at dawn of his third day, when he was crossing a river ford just 20 miles from Sacramento. A group of armed men was camped nearby, and their leader's voice carried clearly across the water as he gave instructions to his subordinates. "The boy can't have gotten far on foot," the man was saying. "Coleman wants him found before he reaches any federal authorities. Dead or alive, but preferably dead. Less chance of awkward questions." Jeremiah spent 4 terrifying hours hiding in thick riverside brush while the search party combed the area. When they finally moved on, convinced that their quarry had taken a different route, the boy emerged soaked, shivering, and more determined than ever to reach Sacramento with his evidence intact. The boy's appearance at the territorial marshal's office created quite a stir. Dirty, exhausted, and clutching a leather portfolio like his life depended on it, 12-year-old Jeremiah Holbrook looked more like a refugee from some disaster than a key witness in a murder conspiracy. But Marshal Thomas Harrison was an experienced lawman who had seen enough of California's gold rush violence to recognize genuine terror when he encountered it. Harrison was a lean, weathered man in his 50s, whose reputation for integrity had survived 3 decades of frontier law enforcement. Unlike many territorial officials who had been corrupted by gold rush wealth, Harrison had built his career on methodical investigation and absolute adherence to legal procedure. His office walls were lined with commendations from grateful communities and wanted posters for criminals who had learned to fear his patient, relentless pursuit of justice. Harrison's initial skepticism evaporated as he examined the evidence Jeremiah had risked his life to deliver. Chen Wei's journal, when translated by a Chinese interpreter Harrison summoned from Sacramento's Chinatown, revealed detailed maps of gold claims throughout the Sierra Nevada region, along with notations about the productivity and vulnerability of individual miners. More damning still were coded references to payments made to the sheriff and the deputy, with dates that corresponded exactly to the suspicious deaths Jeremiah had documented. Ezra Whitfield's letter provided the crucial context that transformed scattered observations into proof of systematic murder. The Vermont miner's careful documentation of Sheriff Coleman's impossible wealth, combined with his detailed timeline of claim transfers following suspicious deaths, painted a picture of corruption so extensive that it staggered even Harrison's experienced imagination. But it was Klaus Weber's portfolio that elevated the case from local corruption to territorial crisis. The German miner's letters to his brother contained not just evidence of the Sutter's Creek conspiracy, but also documentation of similar operations in mining towns throughout Northern California. Weber had been corresponding with other suspicious miners across the region, sharing information about patterns of mysterious deaths and subsequent claim transfers. "This isn't just about one corrupt sheriff," Harrison told his deputy marshal, Jacob Sterling, as they reviewed the evidence late into the night. "This is organized crime on a scale we've never seen in California. If Weber's correspondence is accurate, we're looking at systematic murder in at least 8 different communities." The investigation that followed was unlike anything the Territorial Marshal's office had ever undertaken. Harrison assembled a team of federal marshals, territorial investigators, and trusted local lawmen from communities outside the suspected corruption network. Working in absolute secrecy, they began verifying Jeremiah's evidence and expanding the investigation to encompass the broader conspiracy Weber had uncovered. The Chinese interpreter's translation of Chen Wei's journal proved particularly valuable. The murdered informant had been far more thorough in his documentation than anyone had realized, creating detailed profiles of not just potential victims, but also the members of the criminal organization itself. Chen's notes revealed that the conspiracy extended beyond law enforcement to include prominent businessmen, territorial officials, and even federal land office employees who facilitated the illegal transfer of mining claims. One of the most shocking discoveries was the identity of the syndicate boss that Whitfield had referenced in his letter. Chen's journal contained coded references to a man named Cornelius Vandenberg, a wealthy San Francisco businessman who owned mining equipment companies, ore processing facilities, and transportation networks throughout the gold fields. Vandenberg had been using his legitimate businesses as cover for a criminal empire that systematically identified, acquired, and consolidated the most valuable mining properties in California through murder and fraud. As the investigation progressed, Harrison made a difficult decision. Rather than immediately arresting Sheriff Coleman and his conspirators, he chose to continue the surveillance operation in order to map the full extent of the criminal network. This meant allowing Jeremiah to remain in protective custody in Sacramento, while his mother in Sutter's Creek was told that her son had died in a mining accident. A fiction designed to prevent Coleman from realizing that his operation had been exposed. The deception was emotionally devastating for both mother and son, but it proved strategically brilliant. Believing that Jeremiah was dead and that Weber's evidence had died with him, Coleman and his associates continued their operations with renewed confidence. Federal agents, posing as prospective miners and businessmen, were able to infiltrate the organization and document additional crimes while building airtight cases against dozens of conspirators. The evidence gathered during this extended investigation revealed the true scope of the horror that had consumed California's gold fields. Over an 18-month period, Vandenberg's organization had orchestrated the murders of at least 47 successful miners across 8 counties. The stolen gold claims were valued at more than $2 million, an astronomical sum that represented hundreds of thousands of hours of back-breaking labor by men who had died for their success. But the financial cost paled in comparison to the human tragedy. Each murdered miner represented a family destroyed, dreams shattered, and a life cut short by pure greed. Many of the victims had been sending money back to families in other states or countries, leaving wives and children destitute when the payments suddenly stopped. Others had been saving to bring loved ones west, planning reunions that would never occur. The final phase of the investigation began in October 1851. When Harrison felt confident that his agents had identified all the key players in the conspiracy. Rather than risk alerting the criminals with piecemeal arrests, he coordinated simultaneous raids across Northern California, striking at dawn on October 15th with more than 60 federal marshals and territorial agents. The raid on Sutter's Creek was particularly dramatic. Sheriff Coleman was arrested in his bed, still wearing the silk pajamas that his ill-gotten wealth had purchased. Deputy Patterson attempted to flee on horseback, but was captured within miles of town by agents who had anticipated his escape route. Frank Garrett's replacement, a vicious killer named Samuel Briggs, barricaded himself in the jail and held out for 3 hours before being overwhelmed by superior firepower. But the most satisfying arrest, from Jeremiah's perspective, was that of Silas Fletcher. The funeral parlor owner had been a willing participant in the conspiracy, using his position to help conceal evidence of murder and providing inside information about which bodies were likely to be claimed by family members. Fletcher's cooperation had been purchased with a share of the stolen gold, making him complicit in every death that had crossed his preparation table. The trials that followed dominated California newspapers for months and established legal precedents that would influence territorial law for decades. Cornelius Vandenberg, despite his wealth and political connections, was convicted of conspiracy to commit murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. Sheriff Coleman and Deputy Patterson received death sentences, which were carried out publicly in Sacramento in February 1852. For Jeremiah Holbrook, the conclusion of the trials marked both an ending and a beginning. The territorial government awarded him a substantial reward for his courage in exposing the conspiracy. But more importantly, Marshal Harrison arranged for the boy to receive a formal education in Sacramento. Recognizing Jeremiah's natural investigative abilities and unshakable moral courage, Harrison became his mentor and father figure, eventually guiding him toward a career in law enforcement. The boy's methodical nature and attention to detail, traits that had first led him to count bodies in Fletcher's funeral parlor, proved invaluable in his new life. By age 25, Jeremiah had become one of California's most respected federal marshals, specializing in cases involving organized crime and political corruption. His reputation for integrity and thorough investigation made him a natural choice for sensitive assignments throughout the American West. But Jeremiah never forgot the lessons learned during those terrifying months in Sutter's Creek. Throughout his career, he remained particularly vigilant about crimes against vulnerable populations, immigrants, minors, and others whose deaths might not receive proper investigation. His personal motto, inscribed on a plaque in his office, read simply, "Every life counts, every death matters." The impact of the Sutter's Creek conspiracy extended far beyond the individual prosecutions. The case led to significant reforms in territorial law enforcement, including requirements for federal oversight of local sheriffs in mining districts and mandatory reporting of suspicious deaths to territorial authorities. The scandal also prompted Congress to establish federal mining courts with jurisdiction over claim disputes, reducing the opportunities for local corruption. Perhaps most importantly, the exposure of Vandenberg's criminal empire led to increased federal attention to organized crime in the American West. The techniques developed during the Sutter's Creek investigation, coordinated surveillance, financial analysis, and patient intelligence gathering, became standard tools for federal law enforcement agencies dealing with large-scale criminal conspiracies. The town of Sutter's Creek itself struggled to recover from the scandal. Many residents, horrified by the revelation that their community had been built on systematic murder, chose to relocate to other mining districts. The town's population declined from nearly 800 to fewer than 200 within a year of Coleman's arrest, and many of the buildings along Main Street stood empty for decades. But for those who remained, there was a sense of redemption in the knowledge that justice had finally been served. A memorial was erected in the town cemetery, listing the names of all known victims of the conspiracy and acknowledging the community's collective failure to protect its most vulnerable members. The inscription, suggested by Jeremiah during a visit to his former home, read, "In memory of those who died for gold and in honor of those who lived for justice." Klaus Weber's sacrifice was not forgotten. The German miner's claim, which had been the site of his final battle against Coleman's men, was preserved as a territorial monument. His personal effects, including the letters to his brother that had helped expose the conspiracy, were displayed in a small museum that educated visitors about the dangers of unchecked greed and the importance of community vigilance. As for Jeremiah's mother, Sarah Holbrook, the reunion with her son was both joyful and heartbreaking. The months of believing her child was dead had aged her considerably, but her pride in his courage and moral strength helped heal the emotional wounds. She chose to remain in Sacramento, working as a seamstress for wealthy families, while her son completed his education and began his law enforcement career. The story of the boy who counted bodies became legendary throughout California and beyond. Newspapers across the country carried accounts of 12-year-old Jeremiah Holbrook's courage in exposing one of the West's most extensive criminal conspiracies. The tale was retold in dime novels, stage plays, and eventually became part of the folklore surrounding California's gold rush era. But for Jeremiah himself, the most important legacy was not fame or recognition, but the knowledge that his methodical attention to detail and unwavering commitment to truth had prevented countless additional murders. In later years, when asked about his motivation during those dangerous months in Sutter's Creek, he would always give the same answer: I couldn't let them keep killing people and pretending it didn't matter. Every person who died deserved to have their story told. This mystery shows us that even in the darkest chapters of American history, when gold fever corrupted entire communities and turned neighbors into predators, individual acts of courage could still triumph over systematic evil. Jeremiah Holbrook's story reminds us that justice often depends not on powerful institutions or famous heroes, but on ordinary people who refuse to look away when they witness wrongdoing. What do you think of this story? Do you believe a 12-year-old boy could really expose such a vast conspiracy? Leave your comment below and share your thoughts about what drives someone to risk everything for justice. If you enjoyed this tale of courage in the face of corruption, subscribe to our channel, hit the notification bell, and share this video with someone who loves historical mysteries. There are more dark secrets from America's past waiting to be uncovered, and we'll explore them together. See you in the next video.